It tells us what we don't want to hear, but reveals what is true about who we are. Welcome to the Ryan Holmes podcast, where our goal is to encourage Christian thinking and Christian living. This is episode 20. If you are enjoying the podcast, would you head over to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating? You can do that right now. You can just pause the podcast, head over there, and give us a review. You might already be on Apple Podcasts, so it makes it even easier for you. But if you could give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review, that would be hugely helpful. It'll boost the reach and visibility, help with all the algorithms and whatnot, so that more people can see the podcast. You can also do this on any other audio platform that you might be using, whether that's Spotify, whether it's Google Podcasts. And again, that would be just a huge help to us. You can also support the podcast financially if you want to take that step by joining our locals community. Check out ryanhomespodcast.locals.com and subscribe for only $5 a month. We want to make it as reasonable as possible, and you would just be doing us a huge service and helping us out and supporting the work that I'm doing personally. You'll get additional perks that are exclusive to the locals community members. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, ryanhomespodcast.locals.com. Please also check out wretchredeemed.com. That is our store. You can get podcast merch. You can get t-shirts. There's a few t-shirts there with different designs and looks and whatnot that I think you'll like. You can get an official podcast mug and a sticker. And again, that's wretchredeemed.com, WRETCH, redeemed.com. If you prefer video format, you can head over to YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel there. That would be great. Another way of helping us out. And if you have any questions about the podcast, about Christianity, the Bible, about faith, about this episode today, send me an email to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. I will link to everything in the show notes below, so you don't have to go searching for any of that. It'll be down below, so you can just scroll and check it all out. So thank you, and I hope that you do enjoy today's episode. And today we're covering an exciting topic, given the cultural climate that we currently find ourselves in. And I think it's a good question to ask. And the question is this: is the gospel offensive? Is the gospel offensive? We're not just going to ask the question, we are hopefully going to answer it as well for you. So listen along with us, and I'm excited to get into it, all right? So according to Merriam-Webster, something that is offensive or an offensive remark is something that causes displeasure or resentment. Displeasure or resentment. So that begs the question, does the gospel message cause displeasure or resentment? Or can the gospel message cause displeasure or resentment? As we kind of roll into this and just kind of build up towards really our main point and unpacking all of this, I really want to talk about first our current cultural moment. What is our current cultural moment? Well, we seem to be in a cultural moment that is filled with outrage and cancel culture. And that's not something that we're working towards. That's not something that has been brewing. It's here and it's now. We live in an offended culture. That's just the reality of things at this moment. And I'm not talking about something where people wait until something happens to them in order to get offended by that thing or event or something that somebody tells them. There's actually people that go out of their way to look for things that will cause an offense. Call them an activist, call them whatever you want, but there's people that will literally go out of their way, search through everything to find something that is worthy of the accusation of an injustice or anything that causes an offense. I asked myself, why is that? Why are we so outraged here at this moment? I think there's a lot of things that go into it, but one major thing is the fact that it starts in education. This didn't just come about out of nothing, out of thin air. Of course, if you're taught that the world is made up of oppressor or the oppressed, and how you relate to the world is either as oppressor or the oppressed, you're going to see injustice everywhere and in anything, and always have something to be outraged over. This is often called a neo-Marxist kind of movement in our society and in our culture. Now, Marxism, I think, had more to do with um, what's the word I'm looking for? Economics, but I think that many people have taken his views, his perspectives, and they've just adopted it, and adapted it to essentially every area of life, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's sexual preference or religion, whatever it is. It's basically been adapted to every single facet of our life as we know it, and people are people are outraged over everything, even down to the words that you say. Political correctness has come so far and gone to the extreme where words that you speak can be considered hateful or even violent. People want to force others into submission to where they can no longer say certain things. Now, you might be feeling like I'm heading into a political or free speech kind of talk today, but that's not what I'm doing. My goal is to essentially establish the cultural climate and temperature that we find ourselves in because it is relevant to the subject. We live in a highly sensitive moment today. And by sensitive moment, I don't mean something that's out in the abstract, like out there. I mean people, individuals are highly sensitive today. Some might say too sensitive, and I would agree with that. We live in a moment when the slightest thing can be considered controversial or even extreme. Today we're discussing a topic that could be considered controversial. And based on kind of what I've just set up, and based on how our culture the move that our culture is making, and how highly sensitive it is, um, I think it's an important topic to discuss. And again, the question is the gospel offensive? The starting kind of point, the starting block, to talk about when it comes to the gospel is is super important in this discussion. It's good to talk about the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. It's great. There's so many things that point to Jesus' resurrection, and it's awesome. Obviously, we know Jesus did exist. If there's anybody who ever tries to tell you that Jesus never existed, they are completely and entirely detached from reality. There's no question that Jesus was an actual person who lived in history. Um, we do know that Jesus died by crucifixion. We know that he was buried in a tomb. We know that that same tomb was found empty. We know that his disciples and many of his followers claimed to have seen a physical risen Jesus after his death, and after he was buried, and after the tomb was found empty. They claimed that they had seen him, and then many of his disciples were willing to die for that belief without recanting any part of that perspective and belief. It's good to talk about these things and what these events surrounding what these events surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection point to. There's many different theories. I think that the best theory that explains all of this data is the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, and that the other theories miss explaining at least one or two of those events surrounding Jesus' resurrection. But that is a talk for another day. Well, I've actually already done an episode on that, so if you want to go back and check that out, you can. But it's good to talk about those things. It's good to talk about God's love and grace toward you and me, because ultimately that is the message conveyed in the gospel is God's love for you and me, and in Jesus' sacrifice for all people. But Jesus came to do something specific, which we really can't leave out of the conversation. He came to save people from their what? Their sin. He came to save people from their sin. And this is where kind of the rub or the friction takes place. This is where the alleged controversy happens. In order to understand the gospel, or what's also known as the good news, you first need to understand the bad news. Now, to help somebody understand the gospel, you first need to help them understand the reality of sin. They need to understand the reality of the issue at hand. Let me kind of give you somewhat of an illustration here. If somebody threw me a a life preserver and I was standing in the middle of an open field on dry ground, the life preserver wouldn't make much sense. But if you threw me in the middle of a stormy ocean, I'm going to fully understand the necessity of the life preserver. The good news only makes sense in light of the bad news. The gospel only makes sense in light of the reality of sin. So you cannot be saved, you cannot receive the forgiveness of your sins unless you know what you are being saved from. I only realize the need for the life preserver to save me if I understand the life-threatening situation of the stormy sea. In short, if you want to share the gospel with someone, you have to explain to them the reality of sin. And again, like, sin is not some abstract idea way out there. The reality is you're talking about the individual's sin. Now, here is where it can become offensive, allegedly offensive. What does it mean when you're convincing someone of their own sin? You would have the audacity to tell someone that they are not a morally perfect being. In this outrage culture, we're super quick to point out the evil in another person or group of people. I mean, just look at the news nowadays. All right, I'm sure many of you have either heard or these terms have been hurled your way, but I'm sure you've heard the terms racist thrown around, bigot thrown around, misogynist thrown around. What else? Homophobe thrown around. Nazi thrown around. These words are loosely used on a regular basis. But the irony is that many people who are super quick to point out the evil in another person, they never take the same level of judgment to their own lives. Well, I mean, think about it. If you can label somebody a racist or even a Nazi, you're probably better than a Nazi. So you don't really have to look at yourself, because anything you do is probably not as bad than what a Nazi would do. I don't mean to get too far off topic here, but we never really bring the same level of judgment or scrutiny to our own lives. We are very quick to point out the sliver in someone else's eye without addressing the forest in our own eye. So this is allegedly offensive because we are, first of all, informing people that they are not morally perfect, that they are morally imperfect. Imagine that. People aren't perfect. we are also telling people that they are not enough. They don't measure up on their own, and their self sufficiency will get them nowhere. It's hard for people to admit that they are somehow morally imperfect. It's hard for people to admit that they don't measure up. We live in a world where you have to constantly be trying to legitimize yourself, whether it's our job, our title, our income, our house, our car, our clothes, our number of followers. There really is a heightened sense of insecurity, trying to puff yourself up to be more than we really are. Now, I think social media has just shot this to the moon, has elevated this to the highest level, and probably made this just worse, more like just worse than it's ever been. Um, but why do people struggle with these things of admitting that they are morally imperfect or admitting that they can't do it on their own? Sure, it probably has to do with a lot of insecurity, but I think it all stems from pride. People are too proud to admit that they aren't good enough or that they can't measure up on their own. And I get that, especially for the reasons that we just talked about. It's hard with, especially on social media, to admit, nobody wants to admit that their life is a mess or they can't measure up. We all kind of put out this facade and this face of I've got my life together, everything's great. Uh, Look at who I am, look at what I have. But that's not really reality, and we all know that, and yet social media doesn't really change. But um, and just because you become a Christian, it doesn't mean you'll be free from pride. Christians can and do take pride in themselves just as easily as anyone else. Christians take pride in things like their service or their works, the things that they do, all while even justifying other sins like lust or gossip or lying, cheating, whatever it is. Christians are guilty of this just as much as the next person. Pride is a part of the human condition, and in the Bible it does talk about it some. But I mean, we're not going to go through all of it, but it's kind of sarcastic because it talks about pride a lot. Um, but it really began early on when Lucifer wanted to essentially become God. Isaiah chapter 14 and verses 13 through 14 record this, where it says this. This is Lucifer speaking. I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Essentially, I will make myself like God. He wanted to establish his own throne, his own kingdom. He wanted to be God, and his pride overtook him. Pride is no new thing. It is one of the most original sins, and it persists today through every society through every person. In our in our societies today, of course, no one wants to admit they are morally inferior or that they can't measure up. They certainly don't want to be told that by somebody else, especially even a stranger. So of course, this is something that, yeah, it could cause displeasure or even resentment. The reality is that saying the truthful thing is not always the easy thing. I I fear that I'm going to be hit with this harsh reality more and more as my son grows older. It's a lot easier to just to want to give him whatever he wants in this life. But I know that I will most often have to opt for the more difficult path of saying no, keeping things from him, preventing him from doing things, because this path is what's best for him. Giving him whatever he wants and saying yes to his every request or affirming his every desire might feel like the most loving thing, but this is actually the more harmful thing. I'll have to get used to saying the difficult thing because ultimately there is a better way. And as believers, I think we have to get used to saying the difficult thing because there is a better way. And we haven't been called to the easy thing. If you've believed somehow that putting your faith in Jesus means that your life would be easy, then you have fallen prey to this false presentation of what the Christian life is. Thousands upon thousands of Christians down through the centuries have lost their lives over sharing the message of the gospel. The early church and the disciples are a great example of this. The choices were either persecution, death, or abandon your faith. Doesn't seem like a lot of options. Now, maybe at some time in the future, we may face greater consequences for sharing the message of the gospel, but at least right now, the worst we will do is offend someone. But the best we will do is see someone accept the life-giving message of the gospel. So at this point in the podcast, we're 22 minutes in or something like that, 22 minutes and change. We can say unequivocally that yes, the gospel is offensive. The gospel is offensive. It's meant to cut to the heart of the individual. It's meant to stop you in your tracks. It's meant to be uncomfortable because you cannot experience the peace, love, joy, and fullness of a life found in Jesus unless you first accept the reality of your sinful state and your insufficient attempts to remedy that sinful state. Let me say that again. You cannot experience the peace, love, joy, and fullness of a life found in Jesus unless you first accept the reality of your sinful state and your insufficient attempts to remedy that sinful state. And Christian, you're not going to win a whole lot of friends by sharing the gospel. I'm reminded of Paul's words in 1 Corinthians where he tells us that preaching the gospel is, quote, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So to some, the gospel is a stumbling block, but to many, it is life. Now, as our culture shifts and changes, and thinking about this in kind of what we talked about at the beginning in our cultural setting, today there are many people who wish to weed out so-called offensive things. There's already real life attempts. I can just think about my home country of Canada for a second. There's attempts to prevent you, the Christian, from speaking out about what you believe in. There may come a time where the simple, clear gospel message could be deemed as too offensive to be accepted. It might be far off, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. I think these sensitive times do put you and I, the Christian, to the test of whether we will remain quiet or speak the truth in a truthless age. Now, I don't want to leave us off with the impression that we are to go out and just offend people. It's better that people be offended by the message than they be offended by you. Okay, it's better that people be offended by the message than they be offended by you. The gospel, it cuts through the facade. It cuts through the insecurities of trying to present this image of yourself that isn't real. It cuts through the pride and gets at the heart. The gospel breaks down the walls, and it really has to do that in order to come to the realization of who we are. That is a sinner in need of saving. That's the difficult part of the message of the gospel. The good news, though, is that we're not left in that position of recognizing our insufficiency, recognizing our moral imperfection. We're not left in that state. Jesus offers a remedy for our sinful state. You know, I fully understand who I am. I am a terribly sinful person. But guess what? You are too. I am a terribly sinful person. But that's what makes the grace of God so sweet, is that in that terribly sinful state, God still loves me. God accurately judges my heart, knows the deepest, darkest places of my heart, and still chooses to love me in spite of all that. The remedy I've received is Jesus' sacrifice for me on the cross and the gift of life he offers through his resurrection from the dead. Jesus, he offers that remedy to all people. And he takes our sinful, dead state and imputes his own righteousness onto us so that we can rightly stand before a perfectly holy God. God then doesn't see our sinful, dead state, but the righteousness of Jesus on our behalf. Without Jesus' sacrifice, we remain in our dead, sinful state before God. The scriptures actually echo this in 1 John 5:12, where we are told, whoever has the Son, that's Jesus, has life. Whoever does not have the Son of God, still Jesus, does not have life. Those who choose for themselves a life without accepting Jesus' sacrifice choose for themselves rejection from God and eternal judgment for their sin. Now, someone might say that, I'm not that bad of a person. I mean, I'm no Hitler. I'm certainly better than that guy. And they might be right. Honestly, I can agree with that. They might have lived a very decent life on this earth. But God is perfectly holy. Any sliver of sin is incompatible with his perfect holy nature and his perfect good nature. So it doesn't matter how much sin or how little, it is all incompatible with who God is. Now it can be debated that there may be differing levels of judgment and consequences for those who are rejected without life in Jesus, and I could agree with that and discuss that. But that is a whole other topic for a whole other day. But what's important is having Jesus or not. And that God is not simply rejecting those who do not have Jesus because he just doesn't like them because they don't have Jesus. No, there's a literal impossibility of our sin being compatible with God's perfectly good nature. That's why Jesus is so important, because we receive his righteousness so that we can boldly come before God rightly without any incompatibility present. The gospel literally remedies our sinful state. That doesn't mean we automatically become perfect and never sin, but it's the standing before God that is dealt with. As we live out our lives through the Holy Spirit's work, we slowly become more and more like the one who saved us, that's Jesus, and we leave behind more and more sins as we grow and mature. Well, today, if I can kind of cap this all off and give us a little bit of a summary, the gospel, yes, is offensive. It is offensive. It tells us what we don't want to hear, but reveals what is true about who we are, so that we can find forgiveness, redemption, righteousness, and life found only in Jesus. And Christian, I encourage you to be strong in the time that we live in. Share the message of the gospel with gentleness and respect, but don't shy away from saying the hard things. There is no greater joy than to see someone make the decision to accept Jesus as their Savior. Some will reject his message. Some will reject you harshly, but there will be those who understand and acknowledge what you say to them. This is what Jesus even experienced. He said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Keep sharing the message, because there are many who are searching and many who are desperate for the message of the gospel. Well, that is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, maybe a topic that you want me to discuss in a future episode, please send me an email to ryanhomespodcast@gmail.com. Doesn't guarantee that I'll do that topic, but send it anyways, and I will consider it for sure. Don't forget to visit ryanhomespodcast.locals.com to join our community. I appreciate any support. Check out wretchredeemed.com to get some merch. And if you are on the YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell. And ultimately, please share this podcast, and let's encourage others to think about their faith and live it out. See you next week.